Okay, so what we're doing here in 4.4 is we were factoring quadratic expressions. So I'm looking here and I want to find out what are these expressions in factored form. Now we know when a is equal to 1, it makes our factoring process much easier because we don't have to find out what the factors of a are. We know that the factors of a are 1 times 1 in this, or 1x times 1x. So we are able to split the first term up. And now what we're trying to do is just figure out what are my factors of 40, which when combined will give me 14. And I know that 2 times 20 is 40, but when I combine them, they become 22. And then I have 4 times 10. 4 times 10 gives me 40, and then if I combine them, they will add up to my middle number. So I'm able to find the factored form in here. The factored form of x squared plus 14x plus 40 is going to be x plus 10 times x plus 4. Okay, now looking at b, if I'm going to factor x squared minus 11x plus 30, if I take, and I've identified here the factors of 30, which were 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, and 5 and 6. But when I combine any of those, that becomes a positive number. 30 plus 1 is 31. And if you notice the b value, it's a negative number. So I need to remember that not only a positive times a positive is going to equal 30, but a negative times a negative is also going to equal 30. So I want to make sure that I have a negative 2 times a negative 15. When I combine that, that's negative 16. I have a negative 3 times a negative 10, which is negative 13. And finally, I get down to here, a negative 6 times negative 5 gives me a positive 30, but it will add to negative 11. So my factored form ends up becoming x minus 5 times x minus 6. Now looking at example number, or example C, the one thing we didn't talk about in the other two examples, anytime you're factoring, the first thing you want to do is look for a greatest common factor, because I want that quadratic expression to be in standard form. So I can actually take out a negative 1 from my terms, and I have x squared minus 14x minus 32. Now we're going to factor that expression. And looking at my factors of what would be now negative 32, well, in order to get negative 32, one of my factors is going to have to be negative, because I can't have a positive times a positive give me a negative, or a negative times a negative is going to give me a negative. So one of my factors will have to be negative. So I know that since my middle value is negative, using my integer rules, when I combine a positive and a negative, if the answer is a negative, then that means my larger factor is going to be the negative factor. So negative 32 and 1 is negative 31, negative 16 and 2 is negative 14, and negative 8 and 4 is going to be negative 4. So I'm looking, here's my two terms. So when I factor this, I have x, and I determined that my factors were 2 and negative 16, so plus 2 and negative 16, because negative 16 and 2 when multiplied together give me 32, when added together gives me negative 14. Alright, with that last example on the previous page, we actually pulled out a negative 1 from all my terms, and it was a common factor. So let's practice finding those common factors before we continue to factor our expression. So here, looking at a, I know that a common factor of both those terms, 7n squared minus 21, I know that I have a common factor of 7 in each one of those. So if I were actually to factor out a 7 from each one of those terms first, that would leave behind n squared minus 3. And right now then I know with what we've learned in class that that is not factorable any farther than that, so that would be my final answer. For b, if we look at this, we have 9x squared plus 9x minus 18, and one factor that I do have in common is I can factor out a 9 from each one of those terms. So if I factor a 9 out, I would have 9 times remaining x squared plus x minus 2, and I should be able to factor my trinomial there, so I know that factors of negative 2 are going to be a positive 1 and a negative 2. Well, that's not going to work for me because if I add positive 1 and negative 2, I actually get a negative 1, and I know then here that I know that right here right here I have a positive 1, not a negative 1. So what I need to do is I need to go ahead and reverse those signs, and then that way I would have a positive 2 and negative 1 would give me the proper trinomial, because negative 1 times 2 is negative 2, and then when I combine 2 and negative 1, I actually get that 1 I'm looking for. And then finally, using this last expression, my greatest common factor is going to be 4, so I can factor 4 out of each one of those terms, leaving behind x squared plus 2x plus 3. And I do not believe that there is anything that I can factor. My factors of 3 will not add up to be 2, so therefore that trinomial is now prime, and I am done factoring that trinomial expression.